The wind that October morning carried something more than cold. It carried doubt. Samuel Bridger knelt in the tall grass at the edge of Crow Creek Valley, Montana Territory, 1867, and watched the distant shape of a bull elk move through the aspen grove, 500 yards downslope. 500 yards, half 1,000. A distance that separated hope from hunger, confidence from mockery, and in this particular autumn, life from something that looked uncomfortably like failure. His hands were steady, but his reputation was not. Behind him, a quarter-mile back at the settlement, 3 families waited. The Morrison children had stopped asking when meat would return to the table. Young Thomas had taken to hunting rabbits with snares, a boy doing a man's work because the man tasked with feeding them all had failed, shot after shot, week after week, to bring down game at the distances this new country demanded. This was not Kentucky. This was not Pennsylvania. The game here had learned to keep its distance, and that distance was killing them. Samuel shifted his weight, feeling the 2 straight willow branches tucked into his belt. Each was perhaps 4 feet long, no thicker than his thumb, whittled, smooth, and notched at one end. They were laughably simple, absurdly primitive, and when he had shown them to the other men at Bridger's post 2 weeks prior, the laughter had been neither kind nor quiet. 2 sticks, Jacob Mercer had said, holding them up for the others to see, his voice dripping with the particular contempt reserved for ideas that offend common sense. Samuel Bridger aims to steady a rifle with 2 sticks. The others had joined in. What's next, Bridger? Shooting around corners with bent barrels? Maybe he'll tie feathers to the bullets, make 'em fly straighter. The jokes had continued for days, whispered behind hands, shouted across the compound, repeated until even the children knew that Samuel Bridger, the man who once tracked deer through 3 counties back in Ohio, was now reduced to playing with twigs like some kind of fool. But the elk was there, 500 yards downslope, and Samuel's family was hungry. That was the only equation that mattered now. The settlement had arrived in the valley that spring with all the confidence that came from surviving the journey west. 23 souls, 7 families, 2 wagons of supplies, and the unshakable belief that what had worked in the forests of the east would work in the mountains of the west. They had built their cabins along the creek, planted their gardens, and prepared for the hunt that would see them through the winter. They had done everything right, everything according to the methods that had fed frontier families for generations. Samuel himself had hunted the way his father had taught him, the way every man with a long rifle had hunted since the Revolutionary War. You found your game, you closed the distance, you braced your rifle against a tree or a rock, you aimed true, and you fired. Simple, effective, proven across 100 years and 1,000 successful hunts. But Montana was not cooperating with tradition. The first failure had come in June. A magnificent mule deer buck, standing broadside at perhaps 300 yards. Samuel had found a solid pine to rest against, taken his time, controlled his breathing exactly as his father had taught him, and squeezed the trigger with confidence. The shot had gone wide by 2 feet, the buck had bounded away unharmed, and Samuel had walked back to the settlement wondering if his powder was weak or his sight had been knocked loose during the journey. The second failure came a week later, a young bull elk, this time at 250 yards. Same process, same care, same result. The bullet had kicked up dirt 3 feet low and to the left. The elk had vanished into the timber, and Samuel had checked his rifle 3 times, finding nothing wrong. By July, the pattern was undeniable. By August, it was catastrophic. The other men were having the same problem. Thomas McKay, who had hunted bear in the Alleghenies, missed a standing shot at a cow elk at 200 yards. Jacob Mercer, proud owner of a Pennsylvania-made rifle that had never failed him in 15 years, watched a pronghorn antelope disappear over a ridge after a shot that should have been meat in the pot. Even old Hosea Wright, who claimed to have hunted with Daniel Boone himself, fired 6 times at various game throughout the summer and returned to the settlement empty-handed every time. They were not bad hunters. They were good hunters, using good methods in a place where good was not good enough. The game out here was different. It had been hunted by natives for generations, shot at by trappers and traders, and had learned that humans meant danger. A deer in Kentucky might let you approach to within 70 yards before it spooked. A deer in Montana Territory would vanish at 200. An elk would bed down on the opposite side of valleys so wide that you could barely see them, even with a spyglass. The pronghorn antelope moved across the plains in groups, their vision so keen that they could spot a man crouching in grass from half a mile away. The game here demanded long shots. 200 yards was close, 300 was routine, 400 was common, 500 was where meat lived or died. And at those distances, the old methods were failing completely. A rifle braced against a tree might feel steady, but the human body is never still. Your heartbeat pulses through your arms. Your breathing shifts your shoulders. The muscles in your neck and back make microscopic adjustments. At 50 yards, these movements are irrelevant. At 100 yards, they are barely noticeable. But at 300 yards, a movement of 1 inch at the muzzle becomes 3 feet at the target. At 500 yards, it becomes 5 feet or more. Every hunter in the settlement knew this in theory. None of them had solutions. The buffalo hunters passing through in August had shrugged when asked. "We shoot from prone," one had said, "belly down in the dirt, rifle across a rock or a deadfall. Works fine for buffalo. They move slow, and they are big." But buffalo were not deer. They were not elk. And the one time Samuel had tried shooting prone at a distant buck, he had spent 10 minutes getting into position only to watch the animal drift behind a ridge before he could fire. The surveyors who stopped for water in September had a different answer. "We use tripods," their lead man had explained. 3 legs, adjustable height, very stable. When asked if he could borrow one, the surveyor had laughed. "Each tripod costs $40 and weighs 12 pounds. We carry them in wagons. You are going to carry a tripod up a mountain to shoot a deer?" The answer was obviously no. By early October, the settlement was in trouble. Real trouble. Not the kind that makes for good stories around winter fires. The kind that makes people quietly plan to leave before the snow gets too deep. The gardens had produced, but not abundantly. The soil was rockier and drier than they had anticipated. The root cellar held perhaps 3 months of vegetables for 23 people, and that was assuming they stretched every meal. The fish in Crow Creek were plentiful in spring, but had vanished as the water warmed. The small game, rabbits and squirrels, could supplement the diet but could not sustain it. They needed meat, large quantities of it, elk, deer, maybe even a bear if the opportunity arose. The kind of meat that could be smoked, dried, and stored. The kind that would see them through until March, when the passes would open and they could bring in supplies from Fort Benton. But they could not get close enough to the game to make reliable shots. And the game was not cooperating by coming closer. This was not just an inconvenience. This was not just wounded pride. This was survival hanging on the edge of a problem no one knew how to solve. Samuel had felt the weight of it more than most. He was not the oldest man in the settlement, but he was the most experienced hunter. The others looked to him. When he returned empty-handed again and again, their eyes held questions they were too polite to ask. "Are you losing your skill? Are you too old for this country? Should we be worried?" The children's questions were more direct. "Mr. Bridger, when will you bring us an elk?" "Why don't the deer come close any more? Is it true that back east you never missed?" His wife, Martha, had said nothing, but he had seen her measuring the flour, counting the potatoes, calculating with the grim precision of a woman who knows what hunger looks like and wants to keep it away from her children. When she looked at him across the cabin at night, her expression was not accusing. It was worse. It was understanding. She knew he was trying. She knew it was not enough. By the second week of October, the settlement had held a meeting. Quiet, civil, desperate, the decision was made. If they could not bring in significant meat within 2 weeks, 3 of the families would leave for Fort Benton before the snow. They would winter there, depleting their savings, and return in spring. Or perhaps they would not return at all. Montana would have broken them. Samuel had 2 weeks to solve a problem that had stumped everyone for 4 months. He had spent those 2 weeks watching, not hunting, watching. He watched how the wind moved across the valley, how it swirled and eddied around the ridges. He watched how the heat of the day created mirages at distances beyond 300 yards, making targets dance and waver. He watched how the angle of the sun affected his vision through the rifle sights, how shadows could make a deer look 10 yards closer or farther than it actually was. But mostly, he watched his own body. He went to the ridge above the settlement, set up a target at 200 yards, a piece of canvas stretched over a frame, and tried every shooting position he knew. Braced against a tree, the rifle wobbled with his heartbeat. Kneeling with the rifle across a rock, his legs cramped within minutes, and his breathing became labored. Sitting with his knees drawn up and the rifle rested across them, he found stability for perhaps 3 seconds before his muscles began to shake from the strain. He tried the surveyor's idea without the tripod, stacking rocks to create a rest. It worked, until he realized that every rock formation was different, required 5 minutes to build, and was never quite the right height for the terrain or the target. By the time he had adjusted the rocks, any game animal would have moved or spooked. He tried the buffalo hunter's prone position repeatedly and found what they had not bothered to mention. While it was stable, it locked you into one angle, one direction, and provided no elevation. If your target was uphill or downhill by more than a few degrees, you were aiming at dirt or sky. And if the target moved even slightly, you had to completely reposition your entire body, a process that took long enough to lose the shot. Every traditional method had a fatal flaw. Every common technique failed at the distances this country demanded. He was standing at the edge of a cliff with 2 weeks and no rope. Then, on the 4th day of his watching, he saw the ravens. There were 3 of them, large and black, perched in the top branches of a dead cottonwood tree at the edge of the creek. The tree itself was at least 80 feet tall, and the branches where the ravens sat were thin, whip-like, no thicker than a man's wrist. The wind was blowing hard that morning, gusting to 30 miles per hour, strong enough that Samuel had to lean into it to keep his balance. But the ravens were perfectly still. Their bodies did not bob. Their heads did not sway. They sat as motionless as if they were carved from stone, despite being perched on branches that were visibly swaying and bending in the wind. Samuel stared at them for a long time, trying to understand what he was seeing. The branches moved. The ravens did not. How? He walked closer, studying the tree, and then he understood. The ravens were not rigid. They were fluid. Their bodies swayed slightly, microscopically, in perfect counterpoint to the movement of the branches. When the branch bent left, the raven leaned right. When the branch dipped down, the raven shifted its weight back. They were not fighting the movement. They were flowing with it, using their own flexibility to counter the instability beneath them. It was not a locked, rigid stability. It was a dynamic, adaptive stability. And Samuel realized he had been thinking about shooting the wrong way. Every method he had tried was based on creating a rigid, unmoving platform. Find something solid, lock the rifle against it, remove all movement. But that was impossible. The human body was not a tripod. Trees swayed. Rocks were never quite the right shape. Even lying prone, your chest moved with breath, your heart pulsed blood through your veins, and the earth itself was never perfectly flat. Trying to eliminate movement was a losing battle. But what if you did not eliminate it? What if you just managed it? That same afternoon he walked down to the creek and selected 2 straight willow branches. Willow was flexible but strong, and it grew in abundance along the water. He cut 2 pieces, each about 4 feet long, whittled them smooth, and notched one end of each to create a small V-shaped cradle. Then he walked back to his practice ridge and tried something that every sensible hunter would have called insane. He spread the 2 willow sticks in front of him in an inverted V shape, wide base touching the ground, narrow tips pointing up. Then he placed his rifle across the notched cradles at the top of the 2 sticks, about 18 inches off the ground. The result was absurd. The rifle sat there, balanced loosely across 2 thin pieces of wood that swayed and flexed with every breath of wind. It looked like a child's toy. It looked like a joke. Jacob Mercer had been right to laugh. Any fool could see this would never work. Samuel knelt behind the contraption, pulled the rifle back into his shoulder, and aimed downrange at his canvas target, 200 yards away. The rifle moved. The sticks swayed. Everything was in motion. But the motion was different. When he breathed, the sticks flexed slightly, absorbing the movement. When his heartbeat pulsed through his arms, the sticks bent minutely, distributing the force. The rifle floated in the cradle, not locked down, but guided. It moved, yes, but the movement was slow, predictable, controllable. More importantly, his body was relaxed. He was not straining to hold the rifle steady against a tree. He was not cramping his muscles trying to grip a rock rest. He was simply kneeling, comfortable, breathing normally, and the sticks were doing the work of steadying the rifle for him. He adjusted his aim, watching the front sight drift lazily across the target, and when it crossed the center, he squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, smoke billowed, and 200 yards downrange, a hole appeared dead center in the canvas. Samuel stared. Then he reloaded, aimed, and fired again. Another hole, 2 inches from the first. He fired 6 times. All 6 shots were within a handspan of each other at 200 yards. With a rest made from 2 pieces of willow, he tried it at 300 yards. 4 shots, all within 12 inches of each other. At 400 yards, the grouping opened to about 18 inches, but that was still well within the kill zone of an elk or a deer. Samuel sat back, holding the 2 willow sticks, and laughed. Not from humor, but from the sheer absurdity of it. The solution had been there all along, scattered along every creek bank in the territory. 2 sticks, 2 pieces of wood that bent instead of breaking, that guided instead of locked, that worked with the human body instead of against it. He called them his rest sticks, for lack of a better term. Later others would call them a bipod, though that word had not entered common use yet. But names did not matter. What mattered was that they worked. The next day he made the mistake of showing them to the other men. He had thought, in his optimism, that they would be interested, that they would see the logic, that they would understand the principle of dynamic stability versus rigid stability. He had been catastrophically wrong. Jacob Mercer had held them up for the others to see, spinning them in his hands like they were exotic curiosities. Bridgers invented the wheel, boys. Turns out all we needed was 2 sticks. The sarcasm was thick enough to cut. Thomas McKay had been more direct. "You're going to hunt with those? Samuel, a rifle needs a solid rest. That is fundamental. Those things will blow over in the first wind." Hosea Wright, whose opinion carried weight due to his years, had shaken his head slowly. "I have hunted for 40 years, son. Hunted in the Carolinas, Tennessee, Kentucky, all the way to the Missouri River. I have never in all those years seen a man try to steady a rifle with sticks that move. There is a reason for that. It does not work. I have tested them," Samuel had said, keeping his voice calm. 6 shots at 200 yards, all grouped tight. 4 shots at 300, same result. They work. On a target, Jacob had countered, with no pressure, no cold, no wind, no game animal about to disappear. "Samuel, I am saying this as a friend. You are embarrassing yourself. Use a tree like a normal man." The others had nodded. The consensus was clear. Samuel Bridger was either desperate or delusional, and either way, he was not to be taken seriously. The mockery had spread through the settlement like smoke. The children had started playing a game called Stick Hunter, where they would hold twigs and pretend to shoot imaginary animals, falling over dramatically when the sticks failed them. The women, kinder, had said nothing but shared glances that spoke volumes. Even Martha, loyal Martha, had asked him quietly one night, "Samuel, are you certain about this? The others, they have experience. Maybe there is wisdom in what they are saying." He had wanted to argue. He had wanted to show them the targets riddled with tightly grouped holes. But he knew it would not matter. They had not seen the ravens. They had not understood the principle. And most importantly, they had not faced the truth that their traditional methods were failing spectacularly. So he had kept quiet, and he had kept practicing. For 2 weeks, while the other men continued to hunt the old way and continued to return empty-handed, Samuel hiked to the ridge every morning before dawn. He practiced with the rest sticks in every condition he could imagine: wind, rain, cold, heat, uphill shots, downhill shots, crosswind shots. He learned to adjust the spread of the sticks to change the height, to angle them on uneven ground, to compensate for the slope of a hillside. He learned that at very long distances, beyond 400 yards, he needed to adjust not just for the drop of the bullet, but for the wind drift. The rest sticks gave him the stability to hold steady long enough to calculate those adjustments. Traditional methods did not. He also learned to set up the rest quickly. What had taken him 2 minutes initially, he could now do in 15 seconds. He carried the sticks tucked into his belt, unobtrusive, ready. When he spotted game, he would kneel, spread the sticks, settle the rifle into the cradle, and be ready to shoot before most men could find a suitable tree to lean against. But he had not killed anything yet. The practice targets proved the method. Actual game would prove whether he could execute under pressure. Which brought him back to this October morning, kneeling in the tall grass, watching an elk 500 yards away. 500 yards was the edge of possibility. At that distance, his .50 caliber ball would drop over 40 feet from the line of sight. The wind, currently blowing at perhaps 10 miles per hour from his left, would push the ball several feet to the right. The elk, though standing still now, could move at any moment, and if Samuel missed, the sound of the shot would spook every animal in the valley for the rest of the day. One shot, 500 yards, everything riding on it. He spread the rest sticks in front of him, adjusting them so the rifle sat level despite the slight downhill slope. He settled into position, pulling the rifle tight into his shoulder, and began his breathing routine. Slow inhale through the nose, slower exhale through the mouth. The rifle swayed gently in the notches, following his breath, but the movement was controlled. Through the sights, he could barely make out the elk. At this distance, it looked like a brown shape against the autumn gold of the aspen. But he could see it broadside, and he could estimate the position of the vital organs behind the shoulder. He aimed high, compensating for the drop. 6 feet high seemed about right, maybe 7. He aimed left to compensate for the wind. 3 feet? No, 4 feet to offset the drift. The calculations were guesses built on practice, instinct built on repetition. The rifle settled. The front sight drifted across his imaginary point of aim. He let his breathing slow to almost nothing, waiting for the pause between heartbeats, that half-second of stillness that every rifleman knows. The moment came. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. The smoke bloomed and drifted away on the wind. And 500 yards downslope, the elk took 1 step forward and collapsed. Samuel stood slowly, his legs shaking from more than just kneeling. He had done it. 500 yards. An impossible shot by any reasonable standard. The elk was down, and unless he had somehow managed the world's luckiest wounding shot, it was dead or dying. He walked down the slope, the rest sticks still tucked into his belt, his mind oddly calm. The game trail took him 20 minutes to traverse, winding through the grass and scrub oak. When he reached the elk, it was indeed dead, the bullet having entered exactly where he had aimed, through both lungs, a clean kill. It was a young bull, perhaps 3 years old, with antlers that would make a fine rack, but more importantly, it was meat. 400 pounds of it, enough to feed the settlement for weeks if they rationed carefully. He field dressed the animal there in the grass, working efficiently, the way his father had taught him decades ago. The heart and liver he wrapped in the elk's own stomach lining to carry back immediately. The rest would require help, and he would return with horses to pack out the quarters. By the time he walked back into the settlement that afternoon, the sun was high and his hands were stained red to the elbows. He carried the liver and heart in a leather sack, and his rifle was slung across his back, the 2 willow sticks still tucked into his belt. The children saw him first. They were playing near the creek, and when they spotted him coming up the trail, they stopped and stared. Then one of them, young Thomas Morrison, started running toward the cabins, shouting, "Mr. Bridger is back, and he is carrying something." By the time Samuel reached the center of the settlement, a crowd had gathered. Jacob Mercer was there, and Thomas McKay, and old Hosea Wright, and a dozen others. They looked at the sack he carried, saw the blood on his hands, and their expressions shifted from curiosity to something harder to define. "Well," Jacob asked, his voice neutral, "did you finally find something close enough to hit?" Samuel set the sack down carefully. "I found a bull elk. Young one, but healthy, 400 pounds or so. It is lying in the meadow at the bottom of Crow Creek Valley. We will need horses to bring it in." There was a pause. Then Thomas McKay asked the question they were all thinking. "How far?" 500 yards, Samuel said quietly. "Maybe a bit more. I did not measure it exactly." The silence that followed was profound. 500 yards. They all knew what that meant. They all knew it was beyond the range of any reliable shot they had ever attempted. 500 yards, Hosea Wright repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "And you made that shot? With those sticks of yours?" "Yes, sir," Samuel said. "With the rest sticks." Jacob Mercer's expression had gone from skeptical to something that looked uncomfortably like embarrassment. "You are saying those 2 pieces of willow let you make a shot at 500 yards?" "They provided a stable rest," Samuel said. "Stable enough that I could compensate for drop and wind. Stable enough that I could aim true." For a long moment no one spoke. Then Hosea Wright, the oldest hunter present, the man who had dismissed Samuel's invention 2 weeks prior, walked forward and held out his hand. "May I see them?" Samuel handed him the rest sticks. The old man turned them over in his weathered hands, examining the simple notches, the smooth willow wood, the elegant simplicity of the design. He spread them on the ground, mimicked the position of a rifle across them, and stared downrange at nothing in particular. "I have been a fool," Hosea said finally, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I have hunted for 40 years, and I have learned precisely nothing from ravens sitting in trees." He looked up at Samuel. "You were watching something the rest of us missed. You were thinking about this differently, and we mocked you for it." "You did not know," Samuel said. "We did not want to know," Jacob Mercer corrected, stepping forward. His face was flushed, but his voice was steady. "Samuel, I owe you an apology. I called you a fool." I laughed. "And all the while, you were solving the problem that was going to starve us all. I was wrong, completely wrong." One by one, the other men stepped forward. Some apologized, some asked to examine the rest sticks, some simply nodded, their respect evident. The children, sensing the shift in mood, stopped playing and watched the adults with wide eyes. Thomas McKay cleared his throat. "If we are being honest, and it seems we are, then I will say what we are all thinking. Samuel, will you teach us? Will you show us how to make these rest sticks and how to use them? Because if you can make a shot at 500 yards, then so can we. And if we can all make shots like that, then we will not starve this winter." Samuel looked around at the faces surrounding him. These were his neighbors, his friends, his fellow settlers, in a land that was still trying to kill them all in a dozen different ways. They had mocked him. They had doubted him. But now they were asking him to share what he had learned, and the question was sincere. "Of course," he said simply, "that is why I showed you the sticks in the first place, not to prove myself right, but because we needed a solution. And we still do. One elk will help, but it will not be enough. We need a dozen more before the snow flies." Over the following week, Samuel Bridger taught every hunter in the settlement how to make and use rest sticks. They walked to the willows together, selected the straightest branches, and carved them with careful precision. He showed them how to notch the tops to cradle a rifle, how to angle the sticks for uphill or downhill shots, how to adjust the spread to change the height. He took them to the practice ridge and demonstrated the shooting positions, kneeling for most shots, sitting for very long distances, even prone when the terrain allowed, with the rifle rested across the sticks instead of directly on the ground. He taught them to feel the movement of the rifle in the cradle, to work with it instead of against it, to let the sticks do the work of stability while the body remained relaxed. Most importantly, he taught them to observe, to watch the wind, the light, the animals, the terrain, to think about principles instead of just following tradition, to ask not, "How did my father do this?" but "How does this work?" The transformation was remarkable. Within 3 days, Thomas Mackay made a shot at 370 yards and brought down a mule deer buck. 2 days later, Jacob Mercer took a cow elk at 415 yards. Even the younger men, those with less experience, were making shots at 200 and 300 yards that would have been pure luck just weeks before. By the end of October, the settlement had harvested 6 elk, 11 deer, and 2 pronghorn antelope. The meat was smoked, dried, and stored. The families that had been planning to leave for Fort Benton changed their minds. They would winter here in the cabins they had built, on the land they had claimed, sustained by meat taken at distances that would have been impossible a month before. Samuel's rest sticks became standard equipment. Every hunter carried a pair, tucked into their belt or strapped to their saddle. When traders passed through in November, they saw the sticks and asked about them. When a supply train arrived in early December, the wagon master listened to the story and commissioned 3 pairs to take back to Fort Benton. By the following spring, when the passes opened and travelers began moving through the territory again, the design had spread. Trappers were using them. Surveyors were adapting the principle for their equipment. Even the military scouts stationed at the fort were experimenting with similar rests, trying to improve the accuracy of their long-range shooting. The 2-stick rest became, in that quiet way that truly useful tools do, simply part of how people hunted in that country. Not everywhere, and not immediately, but steadily, persistently, spreading through the West like water finding its level. But the story of Samuel Bridger's rest sticks, at least as it was told in Montana Territory, was never really about the sticks themselves. It was about the moment when a good hunter stopped doing things the way they had always been done and started asking why they were done that way. It was about the difference between rigid tradition and adaptive wisdom, between defending the old methods and discovering new ones, between looking at failure and saying, "This is how it is," versus "This is how it could be." The principle that Samuel discovered that October morning was not new. The ravens had known it for millennia. Branches that bend do not break. Stability does not require rigidity. Sometimes the strongest foundation is one that moves. But knowing a principle and applying it are vastly different things. The ravens had never needed to shoot an elk at 500 yards. Samuel Bridger did, and when he needed it badly enough, he had been willing to look foolish, to be mocked, to stand alone with his 2 sticks while the others laughed. That willingness to be wrong, to experiment, to trust observation over tradition, was the real lesson. The rest sticks were just wood. The insight was what mattered. In the years that followed, Samuel would teach many other hunters the technique. Some would improve on his design, adding adjustable legs or leather bindings. Some would adapt it for different rifles or different terrain. All of them would benefit from the same core insight, that nature had already solved the problem of stability, and all they needed to do was watch carefully enough to see the solution. But whenever someone asked Samuel how he had come up with the idea, he would tell them about the ravens. He would describe the way they sat motionless on branches that swayed in the wind, their bodies fluid and adaptive. He would explain that he had not invented anything. He had only noticed something that was already there. And then he would say something that became, in its own way, as important as the rest sticks themselves. The frontier, he would say, is full of problems that tradition cannot solve. If you want to survive here, you cannot just do what worked somewhere else. You have to watch this land, learn from it, and let it teach you what it needs. The game will tell you how to hunt it. The weather will tell you how to shelter from it. The plants will tell you what they need to grow, but only if you are willing to look. That winter, as the snow piled deep and the wind howled down from the high peaks, the settlement at Crow Creek Valley was warm and fed. The meat stored in the smokehouses was testament to shots made at distances that had once seemed impossible. The families that had nearly abandoned the valley were still there, still planning, still building the lives they had come west to find. And in every cabin, somewhere near the fireplace or the door, there hung a pair of willow rest sticks, carved smooth and notched at the tips, ready for the next hunt. They were simple things. 2 pieces of wood, no more complex than a walking stick, no more expensive than a few minutes of carving. But they represented something more profound than their simplicity suggested. They represented the moment when a community learned to think differently, to question differently, to observe differently. They represented the difference between knowing how to hunt and understanding why hunting works, between following the rules and grasping the principles, between doing what you were taught and learning what the land is teaching. In the generations that followed, many tools would be invented, refined, and forgotten. Some would be more sophisticated than Samuel's rest sticks. Some would be more expensive, more durable, more precise. But few would be more important, because few would teach the same essential lesson. The lesson was this: when you are facing a problem that tradition cannot solve, do not defend the tradition. Do not mock those who suggest alternatives. Do not assume that the way things have always been done is the way they must be done. Instead, watch, observe, learn from whatever source has already solved the problem, whether that source is a raven in a tree, a native technique, a natural principle, or your own systematic experimentation. Be willing to look foolish, be willing to be wrong, be willing to try things that others call impossible. And when you find something that works, share it, teach it, improve it. Let others build on what you have learned. Because the frontier is not conquered by individuals hoarding knowledge. It is settled by communities sharing wisdom, each person adding their piece to the collective understanding of how to thrive in a land that does not give up its secrets easily. The 2-stick rest was one piece of that wisdom, a small piece perhaps, in the vast puzzle of frontier survival. But it was a piece that saved lives, filled stomachs, and kept families together through the winter. And it was a piece that taught anyone who cared to learn that solutions often come from unexpected places, if you are humble enough to look and patient enough to observe. The settlers had mocked Samuel's 2-stick rest. They had called it foolish, primitive, impossible, and they had been wrong. Not because they were bad people, but because they were trapped in a way of thinking that could not imagine alternatives to what they already knew. The impossible shot at 500 yards proved them wrong, but more importantly, it proved something right. It proved that careful observation beats stubborn tradition, that adaptive solutions beat rigid methods. That wisdom comes from watching the world work, not from insisting it work the way you expect. Those lessons, far more than the rest sticks themselves, were Samuel Bridger's true legacy, and they were lessons that the frontier demanded from every person who chose to live there, whether they were ready to learn them or not. The land does not care what worked in Kentucky. The game does not care what your father taught you. The weather does not care what you think is possible. The frontier teaches what it teaches, and your only choice is whether you are willing to be a student. Samuel Bridger chose to be a student. He watched the ravens, learned from the branches, and made a shot that changed how an entire community hunted. The rest sticks were the tool. But the willingness to learn, to adapt, to question, and to observe was the real innovation. That willingness is what carried them through the winter, and it is what carried countless others through the winters that followed, across Montana, across the West, across every frontier where people faced problems that demanded new thinking. 2 sticks, 500 yards. One impossible shot that proved nothing was impossible if you were willing to learn. That was the story. That was the lesson. And that was the wisdom that the frontier demanded from all who lived there, carved as surely into the landscape as Samuel's notches were carved into willow wood.